Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we're going to be talking to Andy Chaleff about his book, The Last Letter. He went on a journey across the country, right, to visit folks,
Yes,
and he's going to tell us all about his trip. I can't wait to hear it. So welcome.
thank you for having me.
All right, so tell us a little, just for people who didn't hear the first show, tell us the journey that you took.
Well, so in the beginning of September, what I
Mm-hmm.
did was I somehow decided I got this thing in my brain that said, Andy, this is a moment to do something special in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, I'm going to drive across the US for 3 months and just invite people in groups to write letters to loved ones.
Mm.
And there were 60 of these groups in those 3 months. And
Wow, Andy, that's
yes,
that is
I know.
incredible. Oh my
I'm
God.
just I'm processing the reality that I've just done 60 of these sessions in that short a time. And
Wow.
and what was even more challenging was driving over 10,000 miles to do all of those
Wow.
those sessions because that drive itself was pretty crazy,
Right.
right?
So it started where and ended where? Was it in a
It,
sequential order or were you like zigzagging across the
pretty
country?
much sequential. It
Yeah.
started in Seattle, drove
Hmm.
down to Irvine, California, where I went to university.
Hmm.
And then I drove across the U.S. Kind of, you can kind of decide to go northern crossing or a southern crossing.
Hmm.
So I went up to Colorado and then through Nebraska.
Oh,
And then
cool.
after Nebraska, like all my food intake went to like really poor food intake because there wasn't a lot to eat that was really healthy in there.
Right.
And then I went up to Boston, and from Boston I went down to Miami, and I
Wow.
just flew back from Miami 2 days ago. So I'm fresh off the boat.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay, so how is your journey landing on you? I mean, how, tell me a little bit about the progression itself and kind of how you were feeling throughout the whole time and how it's changed.
Yeah, well, just now that there's the discovery of how it is after the journey, which is its
Yeah.
own discovery. But during the journey, it was the first phase was since I hadn't done one of these sessions before I began. The
Right.
first like third of it was like, okay, apparently this works, and oh, is it going to continue working? And what might go wrong if I try something new? So that was sort of
Right.
the third.
Right.
And then I started getting like back pain from the long drives. And, I was like, okay,
Hmm.
now I've got to do more self care. And
Right.
then basically the crossover it was nice because I could see that now I needed to kind of get ready for the marathon aspect of it, meaning
Right. You know,
a
from
lot
the
of
East Coast,
sessions.
you mean going down the East Coast and just
Yeah,
like
so going down
once a
the
day.
West Coast, starting on the
Oh,
West Coast,
okay.
I needed to sort of get back into my body again.
Right.
The one thing I noticed is that doing the sessions, I mean, I pretty much cried each session. It wasn't the
Oh,
intention of the sessions wasn't to sit with people and like preach to them or teach them anything. It was just to be with people in vulnerable spaces and allow that vulnerability to guide the writing exercise.
okay. So tell me a little bit about the structure of the class for those who weren't able to attend one of your 60 groups. Can you give us kind of a recap of what you talked about in a session? Because I know it
And
evolved over time.
Yeah, well, in the session, really, I tried to share my own story and what led me to the actual 3 month journey to begin with, and that, of course, went back to the death of my mom. And I spoke about that earlier. When I was 18, I did this sociology of death class, and in the class, I had to come to grips with the fact that I was going to lose everything that I loved, and of course, in that case, my mom was the first thing that came to my mind because my parents were separated, and my dad was very difficult to get along with. So I
Hmm.
really needed her in my life, and I wrote her a letter, and she received that letter. And it was only a few hours after she received the letter that she went out, and then she was hit and killed by a drunk driver.
Hmm.
And that was the 18-year-old me was didn't know how to deal with that. And it took a good 30 years to sort of come to a place where it felt like, wow, all the pain I'd left when I left America 30 years ago was a moment in time to kind of go back with that same pain and sort of allow it to be with people open and allow it to kind of help others also feel their pain in a whole different sort of environment.
And what did you learn about your own life story? You know, because I find that when I tell my own life story, I learn about my life story even in a more deeper way. Did you
Yeah.
find that, or what did you kind of? It's almost like the more you tell the story, you've told the story 60 times. How did
Yeah.
it get recolored, or did it?
Interestingly, it felt like since I didn't prepare, every time I walked in, it was like, okay, now I'm sitting down. It wasn't like I ever prepared for a session. It was
Right.
actually, I felt like I was just another person joining. I wrote letters each session as well. So I wrote my
Oh.
own 60 letters. And it was very much like, I could cry just talking about it. It was like being with people when you could see their pain. And
Mm,
since I allowed my pain to be seen, they
mm,
just connected with me in a way that was totally unexpected for me.
mm,
And as I shared the depth of where my pain came from, what was always almost, I would call it a beautiful pain, was to see the same pain in their eyes. And that was
mm,
maybe the unexpected surprise, was that I was unaware of how much that my feelings were really lived in a very similar fashion. Of course, I know everyone has their own suffering, but as I spoke, I could see in the other eyes that the experiences were almost like, as people felt like they could have written their own lives into them.
mm. Yeah, so that
So,
pain, that experience of pain is universal.
ah,
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
and I mean, and there were some beautiful sessions. Just like there was this weird. I went to a bookstore in Lincoln, Nebraska,
Yeah.
and there were like five. There were five family members at a bookstore, and it was the father of the patriarch, the patriarch of the family. It was
Yes.
he was a bit strong and like very, you felt almost like, okay, he's in his 80s or even maybe a little bit later, and he wasn't necessarily showing a lot of vulnerability. And then I shared my story, and then the
Mm, wow.
family was all, we got to this man, and I kind of didn't really expect much. And then he shared the story that he wrote his letter to his mother, who died when she was sick, when he was 16 years old.
Oh,
And he
oh,
read that letter out. And when he read that letter out, I mean, his family just began to cry.
oh.
And the son came up to me and hugged me in a way that was just, he said he'd never seen his father sit with that level of emotion before.
Mm,
And that was
wow.
just one of these beautiful experiences on top of many of those type of experiences.
And so in
Yeah.
that particular case, he was writing for someone who's already passed.
Yeah.
Which, so I see, I know that your letter was to write to your mom who passed right after she read it. But so people were
Yes.
writing about people in their current life and that have passed away.
Yeah, that changed pretty quickly. That was probably one of the things where I adapted, like I saw the necessity to adapt quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was, as I saw the invitation to ask someone to write a loved one, it quickly became a struggle for a lot of people because they just immediately couldn't find or connect to that person, and then they got into this circular motion of, who am I going to write? And then 10 minutes were wasted in just trying to figure out who to write.
Hmm.
So what
Wait,
I
because
did,
you mean when they were trying to find a current person, is that when they circled around? And what do you
yeah,
think caused that circling around? Because they didn't know
you know,
what.
what I think is that, I mean, you could discuss the parts of the brain and how they function,
Yeah.
but ask a logical question for which requires an emotional response, like
Hmm.
feel into who it is you feel compelled to write to if you knew they wouldn't be there tomorrow. Now, if you
Oh,
can't
wow,
feel the
that was a
emotion,
question. Yikes. So,
yeah, I
wow,
mean,
that's
that
yeah,
would that
that's
would be that would be the direction, let's say.
wow.
And a lot of people are just so confronted that they're like, who, then they're jumping into their logical brain. Who would I write? And it was as if it was an intellectual question where the whole. So I learned something on the fly that was really beautiful. Was that I immediately saw that my intentions with this journey wasn't to impose anything on the participants. It wasn't to kind of force them to move in a direction that wasn't like feeling organic for them.
Right.
So what I said to them was, write anyone living or dead, you can write to yourself. A lot of people wrote to themselves, not maybe,
Mm.
or maybe not surprisingly, but
Mm.
and, and then I also left it open to, I said, don't spend any time thinking about who to write to. If you don't know who to write to, you write dear, and whenever you feel a resistance in yourself, write to whatever that resistance is.
Hmm.
So then it became, some people wrote to emotions or feelings. Some people wrote to, yeah, obviously, to people in their lives. Some people wrote letters that they would have liked to have received from a parent to them, for instance.
Hmm.
So it really went in a lot of ways that I didn't want to control, because I saw somehow whatever they wrote was really what they needed at that time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are letters to themselves. It's like, so the instruction was write to either yourself, someone who's passed, or someone who's living that you think, like if they were gone tomorrow, what you'd want them to say. Was that the?
Well, I kind of churned it into, I want you to be in touch with your emotions. So I
Mm,
said, if you're thinking what to write before you've written it, you're probably not in the right headspace.
okay.
So I said, allow yourself to feel the emotion come up, almost the sadness welling up inside, and whatever you write from that place is perfect. So
Mm,
you don't need to send it to anybody. You don't need to read it. You don't need to do anything except for be with your emotions for this period in relationship to a person, a thing, yourself, whatever it was that you felt compelled to write to.
mm. And so the people that came, so you have this patriarch that came. I'm just curious,
Yeah.
what were some of the reasons that they came? What about the way it was advertised, or what about it compelled them to come? Did you ever get a
Well,
sense of that?
in each one it was very different. So
Mm-hmm.
there was some that came because the friends just said, "Hey, listen, I want you to come." Some were organizations that already existed,
Mm-hmm.
the churches and the synagogues and the well-being centers. All of
Mm,
those were just kind of taking on the sort of the sessions that they might otherwise have done.
mm.
And others were just family members that invited people to come together and then have a session for an evening.
Wow. Wow. I
Yeah.
can't imagine what that was like. So, what were the letters that most touch you?
Oh, I mean, this is, now I'm just gonna lose it, because it's the I mean, that was kind of the whole thing for me, was like, where can I be with someone in a space where they can't be with themselves? So where
Mm,
can I sort of hold space for people who aren't in a situation or in a surrounding which gives them that?
mm-hmm.
And there was just one woman who, I mean, had a highly traumatic experience as a child, abduction and like,
Abduction, you said?
yeah, abduction and
Wow.
rape and the whole gambit. Just,
Mm,
you know, just like in a horrible, horrible state of
mm.
really, and this person wrote the letter to forgive the person who did this to her.
Oh my
And
goodness. Oh
and
my goodness.
it was just that was just one of these really incredible emotional moments. I mean, that was on the scale of most intense, to sort of hold the space for someone that goes down that into that childhood trauma and allows it to be relived with a group. But there
Mm,
were others that were, there was one woman that wrote to anxiety. Yeah,
mm.
and she just, dear anxiety, she wrote 3 pages, and it was one of the most incredible letters of just just it was cussing and frustration and sort of letting go of all of these feelings in a way that it was beautiful.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
Wow, how incredible that these people were sharing. You must have been holding space in ways that were you even realize that you could do? Because that's huge for someone to feel safe enough. Because you were
Yeah,
talking about an hour and a half, or I mean, how
yeah,
many?
2 hours usually.
2 hours. For 2 hours, you're basically a stranger, right? You come in,
Yeah.
you talk about your life, which is just, automatically opens someone's heart to, oh my gosh, like you
Yeah.
never know. So, what do you think enabled that kind of vulnerability and openness?
I mean, I went to the heart of my own pain each time, right? I didn't I
Mm,
didn't I didn't like, there was a woman, like, I went to two women's groups,
hmm
and And there's a woman, I guess maybe in her 70s, and she shouted at me, "I hate you."
I hate
She
you.
said, she said, "I was so wishing that you were going to be another man telling a woman how they should feel. I was so wishing so that I didn't have to show up emotionally."
So I know that you said that you started off by sharing your story, but
Yeah.
you said that each time you were sharing a different part of your pain. What does that mean?
I mean, so where I would be is often when you sit in a room, if you look around you, you automatically know where you feel centered. You know where does it make sense to talk from or talk about. I went to a high school in
Yeah.
Florida. I went and did 3 sessions there, and of course, these people to lay down you might lose your parents, and that's going to like you don't want to lay that on a high
Right.
schooler who's
Right.
just looking to their parents for some level of security.
Right.
So in order to like connect with them, I was vulnerable around how hard life was for me in terms of just as a kid, even having written a book and not even being able to read as a kid, right? Just I
Mm,
let them know that as in my childhood, I had to go to special reading classes, and
mm,
I was often considered the not smart one in the family, right? The black
mm,
sheep. Or so in that sense, just being vulnerable with them in that way
mm.
allowed them to connect. And the teacher in the high school, that teacher was just blown away because the kids wrote, and she started to cry. She told
Oh.
me she'd never seen the kids write before because
Oh.
the special learning, and that wasn't their thing. They're not, and you could hear a pin drop while they were writing. and
Wow.
and it basically, when you ask someone, listen, I'm not asking you to write well, I'm asking you to share your emotions, and whatever comes up is just fine, and you don't have to think like, is it right or is it good, just let it flow. And of
Mm,
course, I explained how that I explained to them in me writing my book, the way I could write it was that I got over the hang up that I needed to be a good writer.
mm,
Like I
mm.
could just share my emotions, and that's enough. Like I don't need to be a good writer, and that allowed me to be free enough to write.
Wow. Okay, so that's an example of talking to a high school class. Tell me give me another one just so I get a sense of how you shared your pain with others.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So that would have been a high school class. I'm trying to think of, like, I was with my family.
Your own family?
Yes, I was with my own family, and that was so hard because I'm there and I'm looking at all these faces of people who experience the same trauma that I experienced, the same life, actually. And actually then I just spent half the time just crying
Mm,
because it was just so hard looking at my mom's best friend and realizing I really hadn't seen her since even the accident. So in that
mm,
sense, there was like, so in how I, wouldn't necessarily say I created space. I stayed connected to the pain even when it wasn't easy. And that was an
yeah.
example of when it was hardest.
So when
Yeah.
you were with all these people who knew your mom, your family members, friends, did they share aspects of your mom, or
Oh,
did they write about your mom? Who did they write about?
um, in those instances, it turned into like a sharing of each individual got to share how it was for them at that time.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah,
Wow, what was that like for you?
it
Wow.
was rough. Even thinking, it was just, you go in and you promise, but ahead of, I promised myself before going in how I was going to show up. But you're like, wow, I didn't know I was going to have to show up like this there.
That's a whole nother level because, I don't know if your family members have ever seen that side of you.
No,
So,
well, they would know that I'm more emotional, but to like really allow it to be seen that openly clearly was new. I would assume. I
wow.
think my sister-in-law said to me, I think a week or so before the session, can you make this one a little bit less emotional?
Good luck with that. Okay, that's really funny.
And
Wow.
she wrote me a letter in that session, and she gave me a hug and whispered in my ear how grateful she was to
Oh,
create the vulnerability when it wasn't necessarily so easy, you know. So
wow.
yeah.
Wow. So I just can't even imagine feeling that much pain. And I, what have you learned about pain?
Well, I've learned it doesn't get old like that. I would have assumed after 40 sessions, I would be like, oh, it's getting bored. It's becoming a story. Like I would have thought it would become a story.
Right.
But what I noticed is that if you sink back down into an experience, then it isn't a story. It's just a part of you that always will have some emotion. And I think the emotion, it it didn't feel like it dissipated. It maybe evolved to be more
Mm,
integrated, I guess. But
mm.
I can't even say that because, some sessions I look at people and I could feel their pain. And then me sharing my story was even more painful to share because I could see that it would be connecting to them in a way. So in that sense,
Right.
it was even harder. So I had a more of a feeling that in some way sharing it was far more connected, or the depth of the emotion around it was far more connected to the groups I was in.
Wow. Okay, so can you give me an example of so you said that you learned about you never got bored with pain, and
Yeah.
then when you shared it, there was some aspect about there was this kind of integration and kind of synthesis that was happening kind of on the fly. Can you give me an example of what that would look like?
Yeah, I would say that so the first sessions, when I was be doing the first sessions, always get to the point when I would say my mom was killed by a drunk driver.
Hmm.
And then that was always hard because actually there was something, it was I spent 20 years saying that exact same sentence and not feeling the pain in it.
Mm. Wow.
And so now, even now talking to you about it, it gets me emotional because now I don't separate from that concept. It's not like, oh,
Mm.
let me state something and then push it down emotionally. So now it just sort of it sits there, and I'll say, yeah, my mom was killed by a drunk driver,
Mm.
and it'll feel real as I say it instead of let me try to pretend like it doesn't really bother me, so I don't create too much tension in my environment.
I see. So it's like you're kind of, instead of running away from it, you're owning it and
Yes.
kind of leaning into it instead of, and each time kind of feeling it in some way. You know, it's so
Yeah.
funny. Not funny, and not even coincidentally, because I was just talking to my husband. I said, these last 2 months have been the most painful months that I've ever had to experience. And it was just, for me, the pain all came from family, which I don't know when you're, because it could be friends, like you were saying, pain from friends, pain from family members. But it was just, I assumed that family members are good when you were writing, when people were writing about pain. Was it, I guess, did you find that it fell into certain categories, or yeah, what would you say you learned about if you were to, because you're a marketing person, if you're segment, like what are the
Oh, if I was going to
flavors?
segment them,
Yes, what are the different pains
cer-
that you heard
it's,
during
I
your?
mean, certainly the top category would have been mother father.
Mm,
So like the degree to, I'm always kind of joking in my coaching work that, oh, there's always a mommy daddy issue, but
yeah.
very clearly the people in the session, to a large degree were writing to one or the other around their pain.
Mm,
So oftentimes, because I welcomed in this other way of writing, which was more connected to what you might be resisting instead of just writing a loved one, what I noticed is that people often were writing to the parent that they had the most trouble with.
mm-hmm.
And there were some really beautiful. There was one person in a session in Boston, and they wrote this beautiful message, like they took all the things they judged their mother for, and they wrote them, "I love you because, I love you because, I love you because."
Oh,
And so they twisted all the things that they had judged their mom for, and made them the things that they now love their mom for. And that was
wow.
really a beautiful letter. That
Hmm.
was really beautiful.
What
But
other? Yeah.
that was the one group, and then
Hmm.
you had a lot of people writing to themselves.
Hmm.
Actually, a lot of people wrote to themselves, and what I saw them writing to themselves was to their self judgment often. So to the
Hmm.
things they judged in themselves, or to the people that they would like to have been or to be. Like that was another group. A lot of people, and one of some of the hardest ones for me to listen to or to hear were the people that wrote to people that committed suicide,
Oh gosh.
because what I noticed is that there's so much unresolved feelings in suicide because you didn't have a chance to say goodbye, and oftentimes people feel a really deep sense of responsibility for what they believe they could have done. So there's a real release in sort of forgiving themselves and the other person for that, for that moment.
Hmm.
I've even had, I mean, just to cross into another weird world, I had someone write a letter to their wife who they were divorcing, that they were going to give the letter an hour after the session.
Oh
So
my gosh.
so I
Wow.
mean, so you really, and they said, please, can I? They said, please, can I read my letter? And okay, and then after they speak, there's just crickets, and you kind of laugh, say, okay, who's gonna go next?
So the format would people would have like like an hour and a half to write and then 30 minutes to read, or how did you
No, no,
organize?
no. Actually, so first, no one had to read it. That was really clear from the start, because if they felt any obligation to read it, then they would have edited themselves, because they would have been anxious about what they wouldn't have wanted to say.
Right.
So
Yes,
that
exactly.
that had to be taken off the table really early. And then what I made sure to do was to give everyone the space to say, hey, if you want to share, then I didn't even suggest reading it, because I didn't even want to put pressure on people that didn't want to
Right.
read it. So I just said, listen, it would be great if you'd share who you wrote, why you wrote them, and if you feel like there's 2 or 3 sentences that you've written that encapsulate the meaning of then please go ahead and feel free to read those 2 or 3
And that was
sentences.
optional whether to even include that.
All optional, and
Wow.
sometimes people didn't. Some groups I wouldn't have expected anybody to have done it. They all read all the letters, and other groups I would have thought everyone would read it, and then no one said a word.
Wow.
so
Mm.
so it was really, there was no imposition of like this has to be any given way, because that would have just taken away the beauty of this. The beauty, it didn't the beauty wasn't because they shared their grief. The beauty was sharing the moment. One
Mm.
wasn't any less powerful than the other. You could
Mm.
see the pain in everybody who didn't share, which made it almost all that much more beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I was starting off I two for over these last 2 months, my husband's mother passed away.
Yeah.
And that was just, supporting and loving and kind of just, watching all of that and everything that entailed. And what happens is I realized that, like, if one person, which is part of the family, changes, then everything kind of changes around it. And so, even
Yeah.
the letter, I assume, when someone writes a letter, I had a client once where he had a very troubling relationship with his family. And I said, just write a letter. And he wrote this letter. I mean, it was like 20-page letter to every single person in his family with all the hurt feelings of the judgment and pain that he had throughout his life. And just that process of cathartically expressing the pain and, how what it did to him on the inside. And then he was like trying to figure out what to do with all this stuff because there was a lot of like anger and hatred and
Yeah.
bitterness and all this stuff. And I said, well, why don't you find some way of, that those letters are still part of you, but why don't you find some way of transforming those thoughts into something else? So I said you could actually take all of the letters, burn it, and then,
Hmm.
take the ashes and, use it to bear, you
Yeah.
know, for a tree, bury it with a tree and something hopeful. And he decided to he took all of it and all these letters and he put them in a big boiling vat of water, and
Uh-huh.
they all disintegrated. And then he
Uh,
took it, and because he's an artist, he went and made a beautiful paper mache object that he then
wow.
had as like, this is kind of like a physical, tangible manifestation of a transformed energy of like hatred to something of beauty and art, but still recognizing that those things in his past were still there. And it's just beautiful to just watch, one, the letter writing, two,
Mm,
and when he did that, he just wrote the letters. He actually never gave letters.
mm,
And what he said happened is he got a phone call from his brother saying, "Hey, I'd like you to come to my, special party." And
uh,
then all of a sudden he was estranged from his family, and then slowly but surely he got re-invited back. They had the
uh-huh.
conversations, and all he did was write a letter that he didn't even send,
Yeah.
but just changing the energy around how he was holding the pain in himself
Mm,
changed the whole world around him.
yeah.
Um, did that was at least his experience? Does any of that, I don't know,
Oh
does
yeah.
any of that relate to how
For
you felt through the whole experience?
Well, I mean, at least the shared experiences back to me. I got a lot of estranged members coming back together. So that was certainly one of the byproducts of the activities. You know, a
Wow.
woman who hadn't spoken to her mother in several years just said, "Oh, it's time to invite her to lunch and reconnect," because she was projecting onto her mom all these things that she actually didn't wasn't really reflecting on. And then
Mm,
she immediately saw, oh, she didn't have any compassion for her mom. She needed her to be someone that she wasn't. And, a lot of people have that experience, but to bring it into awareness so it's no longer judged,
mm.
that was certainly, there was a lot of that.
Yeah, where people would actually go to the workshop, send the letter, and then wrote you saying, "Oh my gosh, this is what happened afterwards."
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Or some people were wondering if they were going to send it, then they sent it, and then they were really surprised by the replies that came back from them. They were
Yeah.
really very important to the people.
Wow, those
Yeah.
letters are important. Were they, so they shifted relationships, started a dialogue about
Oh,
something that wasn't going to be communicated otherwise.
yeah. I mean, what I would say about the letters across the board were that they were a release. Whatever
Mm,
the release was, it was a release. And when it wasn't, then I just started to practice because sometimes I could feel like I didn't have a lot of time,
mm-hmm,
and
mm,
um, I could sometimes see when someone wrote a letter that the letter didn't lead to any resolve. So
mm.
there was, of course, and not like you need to solve everything, but let's at least give them a pointer on how they might connect and ground that emotion. So
Mm.
I started to practice during the session, which I don't know if it uses a cuss word, so I'm not exactly sure if that's
Well,
appropriate
if
given
it's,
our.
you can just like say F word or say it in French.
So basically, what I did was whenever someone would resist something, and I could tell they resisted it because there was some level of self-judgment
Right.
connected to it, I'd ask them to embrace the self-judgment in the harshest of terms, say, "I am a bad father,
Hmm.
and it's effing great."
Ah, okay, got it. Wow,
So
interesting.
I just ask them to take the full emotion and then absorb it and don't give it a place because whatever you resist persists. And what I saw happening over and over again is that people would give a chuckle and they'd feel the release of the moment because they no longer attached to the idea that they needed to be whatever it is that they
Okay,
didn't
so like
want to
I'm a
be.
real selfish bastard and I embrace that aspect of
And
myself.
and it's effing great.
And it's effing great. And then so just even, so they kind of wrote about themselves without judgment. And that, just the process of doing that, release the tension of shame or guilt associated
In a
with that
lot
feeling.
In a lot of cases, yeah. And then at
Wow.
least it didn't. Let's not overly state it solved it, but
Oh,
it
no, they
resolved it.
should.
It resolved the tension at that
Yeah.
moment, and it gave
Yeah.
them a pointer on how to release when there's a self judgment going on.
Mm,
Yeah.
wow. Wow, that's really powerful. Well, it through my experience, so my husband's mother passed. I then went to it was all these beginning and endings from
Yeah.
September 11th all the way to yesterday. There
Yeah.
have just been beginning ending beginning ending. So I went to a wedding, and I realized that well, actually, let me go back a little bit. I interviewed you, and then I interviewed a gentleman who is a hospice worker,
Uh,
and I was saying, what are people's regrets? And one of the key regrets that people have on their passing is not making amends to the with relationships that have gone askew. And he said
yeah.
the problem is that oftentimes they never get resolved because let's say I had a troubling relationship with my dad, and I didn't, but let's say I had a troubling
Mhm.
relationship. I didn't get he was sick in the hospital with a long cancer, and I didn't want to burden him with my unresolved
Yeah.
issues. And so basically what happens is they never get resolved, and then
Yeah.
he passes, and then there's this kind of like unresolved tumultuous whatever. And he said it's really important to, before that time comes, to have the conversation with your mother or father and tell them what it is that you want to say. And I said, well, give me an example. And he said, well, for my own father, people should listen to the show because I may be botching this up, but this is
Yeah.
the generally the thing that he said. He said, for my own father, I was really resentful that he was at work all the time. And I
Mhm.
didn't feel like he loved me in the way that I wanted to. And so I told him that. We had a conversation. I told him, and he said, well, the reason I wasn't around was because I was loving you by working, because the way that I was raised from my father is that the way to love you is to provide for you. And that's what I've
Mhm.
been trying to do. And I'm sorry that, there's just like, that's it. And then it was kind of like, oh, huh. And so this huge resentment that this gentleman that I interviewed, he said all that resentment, just like, oh, I get it. Like there are just all these misunderstandings. And so I had just gone to a wedding with my mother, who's now like 86, and my
Mhm.
brother, who's now 60. And, I walked into the wedding like a 5-year-old girl. Like I walked in like, oh, my mom's gonna, bleh. I had all these like stories and beliefs about what was gonna happen, and all of this past historical crap that was just layered on top. Same thing with my brother. And I realized, like, wait a second, like, I don't even, like, I've created these, like, fictional characters that don't even relate anymore to the real people that exist that I'm
Yeah.
looking at this very moment. And the moment that I realized that, I've been, let's say that between, age 0 and 18, maybe some of those emotions were, like, yeah, that stuff was real and it happened and it was hugely painful. But when I recognized that at this juncture, when I'm 55 and they're 60 and whatever, you're almost 90, it's like
Mhm.
these stories are no longer relevant. And when I recognize that all these stories were just not relevant, there is just pain associated with like how many years have I wasted in my life not really seeing these family members as they
Yeah.
are, instead of seeing them as these fictional characters that fall within the story of my fictional life, like my view of their life. And what was interesting through that process is when I what happened is I looked at my brother and he looked exactly like my dad, who I
Oh.
loved. And so my brother, who I had really estranged, hard feelings with, all of a sudden that person had a face that I loved. And it was just like a collapsing of two realities. And my whole brain was like, "Wah!" And when I
Yeah.
did that, I actually felt love for my brother, which I've never have had in my whole life.
Uh,
And when that little like moment of love, it was like a little light. If I could just open up my heart to love him, then what surprisingly came was a rush of pain, like
Mm.
all this pain
Yeah.
of how why I didn't have that light, and to go to actually go through that light, I had to travel through the pain, and it hurt like hell. It
Mm.
was so bad, and
Ah,
it just I don't know. So I don't know how. I guess I'm wondering how you handled all the pain, because for me it was just overwhelming to feel that pain because I hadn't allowed myself to feel that pain that had been there for, like 55 years of just these painful thoughts. So, do you have any
yeah.
thoughts, having gone through your own experience, how one learns to deal with the pain? I'm hearing one thing, which you said, it's kind of you realize it's a shared human experiences and that your pain is universal.
Yeah.
But
But that doesn't get to your question
yeah, I'm
though.
wondering, yeah, how did you
And and
deal with it?
and I just it touches me in that the humorously one of the biggest challenges was that when because the book was done and I was everyone would be asking, can you sign the book? And then when I was writing and signing the book, I was now confronted with a voice in my head of my dad who would always tell me that wasn't going to, amount to anything.
Mm.
So in that sense, like writing my name was this really painful exercise because in a way it was like I had to almost go to this childhood feeling that said, by signing this, I'm saying I am good enough, or the book is,
Oh.
and in a way, there was always a diminishing of anything that I'd achieved. So,
Oh.
even still to today, I don't necessarily like someone says, "Do you take pride in the book?" I'm like, "No, the book is there, and I mean, it was
Wow.
created, but I don't necessarily attach to a pridefulness in the book. It's
Hmm.
just it's just almost like, oh, and there'll be another thing I need to do to prove whatever that I'm enough, and another thing to prove that I'm
Hmm.
enough.
Hmm.
And of course, that theme I saw in a lot of the people in the sessions was that they never felt that they were enough.
Hmm.
So in signing the book, the way that I dealt with the thing that you just were discussing, which was how did you allow yourself to feel the pain and like give it a space where it didn't necessarily come out in any other form. And the only way I did that was just by loving it.
Hmm. By loving the book,
By
loving
no
the
no by
pain.
loving the pain, by loving the pain, by like loving that part of me that was still incapable, by loving that part
Oh.
of me that actually still needed that acceptance or appreciation and not needing to solve it, not needing to do anything. I would just fully embrace it. I would talk about it when it came up in a session. I would feel it when I signed the books. What I quickly learned is that I couldn't just sign a book without it having a meaning for me. So I couldn't just sign my name. There was no book that had my name in it, right? That would
Mm.
be the most preposterous thing in the world for me.
Right.
So basically, I always looked and I can always connect to something that I see in another person that's reflected in me. So
Mm.
I know me and then I see them and then I basically write the quality or the thing that connects to what I'm feeling. So I
Mm.
basically wrote that and then I wrote in every single book I signed, I love you.
No.
And
Oh.
that was like, yeah. And
No.
sometimes it was hard to write
Yeah.
because it was like a love, like I'm giving you that love and I'm giving me that love. And I'm
Mm.
not going to make this an insignificant moment.
Mm. So it's loving yourself as you're going through that pain and loving the other person who's going through that pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I was meditating on this whole idea of pain because
Hmm.
I yesterday I just came back drove to Vancouver for 3 hours, delivered a eulogy, drove 3 hours back, and on the drive back from delivering a eulogy that my uncle he just passed away. I found out that my aunt has lung cancer, and I was like, I mean, like I just can't, like it just like hit a level, and it was interesting because it was almost like just like the wind, it's like after my, going through the just kind of the pain of feeling all this pain from my childhood
Hmm.
of a mother that I had challenges with, a brother that I had challenges with. And then we recently had just this whole remaking of Thanksgiving. Like, I don't want whatever is happening to happen anymore because I have a
Yeah.
different. So it's just like that was just big, a big tumultuous thing. And then people were getting married, people are dying, people are getting married, people are dying. Like, it's just like literally, it's like my son is coming back from college, he's leaving, and I'm realizing like, oh, this is a new normal. He comes back, you know, there's just so much love and love in when he comes back, and then when he leaves it's just like, you know, someone like takes a little piece of my heart, carves it out, and like
Yeah.
walks out the door. And
Yeah.
so all of this kind of like it's life, right? This is life happening. And
Yeah.
I was contemplating it today during my meditation, and a lot of this is an outcome of when you open your heart. Because I'm on a meditation practice. It's all about opening up your heart. So
Yeah.
when you open up your heart and you don't put the defenses in you know there anymore, you actually feel the pain,
Oh,
and it's like, oh my
oh.
Lord, this
It-
pain hurts my heart. I wish I could go back to the point when I would just nullify this whole thing, but it hurts so bad.
yeah. I was in coming back home after this journey, I've noticed like I'm like shorter than I was. Like the emotion is more raw. Allowing the feeling. I needed to allow the feeling to be present during the sessions. So when people are really jerks on the road, which is quite normal in Amsterdam, then you basically, normally I would just say, "Oh, just whatever." But now I'll be like, "Hey, what are you doing?"
Yeah,
Just
I
like,
guess it's like it's more like I guess if you open up your heart, you're opening it up to everything, right?
yes,
Just
you're
that
opening up everything.
it's
Yeah,
not
that's
because when
that's it.
people are like, open up your heart, and it's like, because I want love and rainbow and
Yeah.
unicorns to fill it up,
Mm,
and it's like, actually, I don't think it works that way. I'm
yeah.
realizing it gets, when you open it up, like a rush of stuff you don't want comes in, you know,
With it.
pain and
Yeah.
anger and shame and
Yeah, exactly.
jealousy and hatred. And it's like, oh
Yeah.
my God, I didn't know. Opening up
Yeah.
your heart. But then the thing that, what I was talking to my husband today, and he said, you know, when you open yourself up to pain, when you open your heart up and you feel both the pain and love, it's like you could almost imagine as if you're opening to the universal heart and
Yeah.
love and pain, which is what I'm hearing you say. And it,
Yeah.
you know, you could call it God's heart, or, you know, like you're transcending from your own individual heart to a universal heart where
Yeah.
it's God's heart. And if that's a journey, when I think of it that way, that I think, all right, this pain feels bad. Like I like
Yeah.
want to run away from it. But when I think, okay, no, stay there, you know, open up, keep on opening up, even though it feels awful, then I know
Yeah.
that I'm moving more towards um, God's heart, if that makes sense, like a universal
Yeah.
heart. And that
I
feels
would.
like a goal worth reaching.
Yeah. Well, I would say that in general, that was the state, as you described it, which I was endeavoring to hold when I go into these sessions. It was just to be present. You know, everything could emerge. Nothing was pushed. I was in a session with a Mormon group that was like five different couples. And basically, we didn't even get to writing a letter because 4 hours after their questions, we just kept going and going and going. And apparently, there wasn't a letter to be written at that session, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so that was kind of the energy, was whatever's meant to be is meant to be. And if you like love through the process, then everyone that'll just that guided me for the 3 months.
Well, the thing that and that reminds me of something that I wrote today. Is like that, what it does is it builds the muscle of love, right? I mean, in order to feel that much pain, there has to be a commensurate love that is
Yeah.
greater than the pain. And I guess that's the way in which you're working out your heart. You know, if your heart is opening and you're feeling, you know, the weakness or vulnerability or of the pain and the sadness and the shame and the
Yeah.
guilt, if you can correspondingly make the love bigger and greater, then you're like expanding the muscle of love in
Yeah.
your heart. I mean, it sounds corny, but I think that
Well,
that's what I'm
not,
learning from what you're saying.
I would agree because what happens is what you know when you associate pain with that the loss, and when you go into this negative reinforcing loop of you go into yourself and it creates depression. It's very different than feeling the pain and then giving that pain love.
Yeah, it really is. That's a huge thing.
And that's
That's my aha
yeah.
for today. Thank you, Andy. That is like a huge aha. Honestly, I was writing it, but I just didn't. Sometimes you can cognitively understand it, but
Yeah.
at some level, you're like, okay, I get it. But I do
Yeah.
think that your stories have really kind of highlighted that.
Yeah.
So, what a
Yeah. I
wonderful
wrote like
journey. Yeah.
I wrote like letters from my mom and my father to me as if they were still alive.
Wow.
And that those were really and even having to and I read every letter I wrote in the session at the session. So it was, writing those letters of what they would have said to me if they were still alive was just it was incredibly emotional. So
Mm,
so in that sense, that what you just spoke to was me giving that love to myself that was so hard by feeling into how I would have felt if I was my mom or my dad and writing to me.
mm. We've been talking to Andy Chaleff about his book, The Last Letter. Thank you so much. Those letters that you had hoped that your parents would
Yes.
write. What happened? And you gave yourself that love.
Yeah.
How did it change? What changed for you?
Well, I mean, the beauty of it was like, so you, imagine you're doing 60 of these, okay?
Yeah.
And my criteria for writing is if I resist, I write it. Like that's the criteria.
What does it mean when you resist, you write? Like, I don't understand. So if a part of you is like,
Okay.
oh, I better not write this, is that when you write? Or what does it mean?
No, no, no. So like once I wrote Dear, and then there was like a man in the room that had terminal cancer, and I just wrote Dear Death, and then I just wrote two pages to death,
Wow.
and then I gave that letter to the man that was dying of terminal cancer,
Wow.
right? And just it was I was one time I was like so tired, and I could see that if I continued on this path, I my life would be shortened because it was just too physically. So I just wrote Dear Exhaustion, and then I wrote to exhaustion.
Mm.
Or when I wrote my dad's letter, it was like, I wrote really feeling in. Now it feels emotional. I like wrote feeling into like if I had me as a son doing this activity, I wrote Dear Andy and just wrote the letter as if, it was my dad writing to me now.
Mm.
And just it's incredibly emotional,
Mm. And
right?
is your dad still alive?
No, no, he died 10
Oh,
years ago.
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So how does it change everything when you give yourself that love that maybe you would wish your dad had given you? What changes for you?
I mean, I don't know if it's a change except for it's like imagine so wherever there's tension, so I would go by the simple principle where whatever you resist persists.
Mm-hmm.
So and the resist will change on a daily basis. So you can't just say, "Oh, I have this big ticket item in my life." No, maybe one day I resist anger towards a person, or maybe another day for some reason I see something and then my mom's face comes up and then I resist feeling that pain. Or on another day for some reason my dad's face comes up, or someone mentions the reason why I wrote my dad was because I started to realize that in the book I really loved him when he died, right? We really had a very good relationship, but in the book he's portrayed horribly because that was the reality as a
Oh, right,
child.
right.
So I felt into how hard it was to sort of not give him his fair due,
Yeah. Oh,
like
wow.
so. And then that was like, so when that came up, I wrote the woman that killed my mom, that,
Oh,
and
wow.
I didn't have any intention to write her, but then someone wrote me and said, Andy, have you had any contact with her? And then I was like, oh, now the resistance comes. Like I wouldn't have even thought about her, but then
Right.
so then it was like, oh, I don't want to write her. Oh, I have to write her now. I mean, that was basically how the process ran.
Wow. Wow. God, I can't even imagine what it must feel like now coming back from. a couple days coming back.
Yeah.
What do you think the rest of your journey looks like at this juncture?
It's what I noticed today. I was just sad. There was
Hmm.
just like first it was like let's do a lot of admin, and
Right.
then it was like where do I go from here?
Yeah.
Like everything that I was doing feels a little bit just I don't know, just it's powerful. It's
Yeah.
nonprofits having a major impact in the world. It's not like you could say, oh, you're wasting your life away, but then again, it's not touching the essence of this universal humanity, which is just so it's just so beautiful, and
Yeah.
and at the same time, I have to look after my own well-being as well, right? It's
Right.
not
Yeah. Like you may not be able to live on just going to write letters with other
yeah,
people, right? So you have to actually
exactly.
have your livelihood and then also I'm hearing your soul work. Like how do you fulfill
Yeah.
both, right? Because I can't imagine what that feeling must have been like to be there and just it's just such a soulful, intimate kind of meaningful place. Like there's probably nothing more meaningful than those 60 sessions. I can imagine if
Yeah.
I were to do that, there'd probably be nothing more meaningful that I had done in my life up until that
And
moment.
I mean, the last letter I wrote was to the last letter. Like
Mm-hmm.
I wrote, I don't believe I'd do anything more meaningful than this in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The last session was at a retirement home with someone that was 98 years old, and
No.
and there's one person that they were senile, they couldn't function, they didn't like they kind of were in a special unit because but they kind of let them out to do certain things, and this person like wrote about their childhood in a way that was so elegant and clear and like as if there was nothing wrong with them at
Wow.
all, because when you trigger emotions, you connect to a much deeper space in yourself.
Wow.
You don't get
Wow.
lost in the minutia of logic and trying to understand. You're just feeling. And
Right.
this person shared their 8-year-old journey of getting whatever their Christmas gifts were over a certain period. And
Oh.
yeah, so yeah, it was really magical. It
Yeah,
was
what a
magical.
gift to get this person who probably has can't express really what's going on inside of her to give her a release, like you said, for her to express something that she wasn't able to express probably for years, right? If she's been
Yeah,
senile, people are assuming that she doesn't understand, she doesn't get it,
yeah,
all these different things.
yeah,
And there is a part of her that does and that couldn't express that. And to just write that letter is probably just so beautiful. That's
yeah.
great. Wow.
Yeah, so it was just beautiful. And basically I wrote the next book because all of this material was the next book. So I just transcribed on each trip, the all of the
You
content.
are a good multitasker.
It's like, well, wow, I've
Seriously.
got intense, intense, intense experiences, 10 hours of driving. What are you gonna do? Like I'm not gonna listen
So
to
did you just
Spotify.
dictate it into a book?
I
Like,
just dictated the whole thing. I have a few, like I must have 50 hours, I would assume, something in that direction. No, let's say, let's be fair, 20 to 30 hours, I guess,
wow.
of
Okay. Well, I look
dictate.
forward to interviewing you on your next book.
Yeah,
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show and love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.
We've been talking to Andy Chaleff, and we've been talking about his book, The Last Letter. Thank you so much. What beautiful stories.
thank you.